Hello and welcome to part 4 of our Excel courses. This course is all about data importing, pivot tables, charts. It does assume you have some Excel knowledge already. Go and have a look at our other earlier courses, particularly numbers 1 and 2. If you're using these courses to study for MOS, pivot tables are not part of the lower level MOS exams, but are really useful in the real world. You may find the sample materials for this session linked to close to this video. If you're a York St John student, you can go into Moodle, in the student menu, and go to digital training. Select digital training courses on the left, Excel training courses in the middle there. Scroll down, and this is number 4. You need 2 files for this particular course. Double click on them both and download them. We'll open up the Excel file first, and you'll need to enable editing. So the first thing we're going to look at is importing data. We're going to have a try at importing data from a CSV file in a moment. First, let's look at the text to columns function. Here I've got some data that's been brought in. It's actually separated by commas. Excel has a really useful function to split that out and make it into separate columns. I'm going to click on the A at the top here to highlight that whole column. In the data menu, there's text to columns. Delimited means there's a character in between this. These have got commas in between them, so that's what I'm selecting here. You can pick the character it's going to look for, and you see a preview below that's giving me some confidence that it's going to get the right thing. On the next screen, you can give Excel a hint about what some of the data is. The date column here is showing as Excel date numbers, but they're not showing in date format. So if I click on that column and tell Excel that they're in date format and to put them into DMY for UK format, other choices are available there. Lastly, clicking on the Finish button, and that's taken each one of those lines of data and separated them with the commas, and you can see the dates there have been correctly turned back into dates. Let's have a look at a similar process. We're going to bring in some data from outside, and this time we're going to use Power Query, which is a very powerful feature. We're just going to have a really simple example in it today. So we're on the data menu. I want to get a file that's a CSV file, comma separated values. I need to select that file. Mine's in my downloads. There it is there. We get a preview of the data that's going to come in. Again, this is the same data we saw before, comma separated. Excel spotted the dates this time. If we click load, it'll load immediately into a new tab. If we want to put it on an existing tab, we can go load to and tell Excel where to put it. But I'm actually going to go transform data. This opens up Power Query. And Power Query can do a lot of things to data. A very simple example today though. Here in the colour column, all these colours have got an adjective as well as the colour, and I want to split those out. So to do that, I can select the colour column, I can select split column. By delimiter, they've all got spaces in between them. So if we say select by space and OK, that's turned one column into 2 columns now. A bit beyond the scope of today, but Power Query can do a lot of things. If you find yourself manipulating data every time you import it, you can get Power Query to remember that and apply it to different files later on. Last thing to do is close and load, and again If we load to, we can tell Excel exactly where to put it. If I just close and load, that will open it up onto a new tab. And there it is. We've got the same data. It's been turned into an Excel table. Technically, that's still linked to the data file that it came from. So if that data file changes, Excel will spot that and reload the data from that file. The Queries and Connections tab is opened up over here. You can open and close that from the Data menu. If I want to, I can right-click this and delete the query. What that's going to do, that's going to separate the file that this came from the copy that's in this Excel sheet, making it a standalone copy that won't be updated if that original file is updated. And there we go. That's a very brief look at importing data into Excel. There's lots more you can get involved with that. Next, on sheet C, we're going to have a look at pivot tables. Just to give you a flavour of what we're going to see, here is a very simple pivot table based on one of the columns of the data we've got. Here's a slicer to allow me to manipulate the data, a pivot chart to go along with it, and on the right here is the setup area. But let's make our own. First, we'll have a quick look at the pivot table data source. It is a table. You don't have to have a table as a pivot table source, but it is the best way to work. Note the different columns we've got. We've got name, employee number, renewal date, department colour, fruit, number of fruit, cost of fruit each, and a bonus figure. Pivot tables are all about summarising that data. So to create a pivot table, click anywhere in the data, go on the Insert menu, and you can click Pivot Table. There are other options there available to you. I'm just going to click the main Pivot Table button. It's selected the data, and it's saying it's going to put it onto a new worksheet, which is what I would suggest to start with. When you create a pivot table, it opens up on a new sheet, unless you selected otherwise. It will call it sheet 1 or similar. A good idea would be to double click that, give that a name that means something to you. When you come to add things into a pivot table, you'll see the pivot table fields box on the right. If you click away from the pivot table over here, the box disappears, so you need to click on that box to get it to appear. Nothing actually appears on the sheet, but on the right you've got the pivot table fields. You can get into a mess of pivot tables very easily by just applying too many fields at once. So let's go through some simple examples. If I drag the colour field into the rows box down here, on the main sheet I'm seeing all the things that Excel has found in that colour column. So it's found all the different entries, only listing them once each. That in itself is quite a useful function. You can see all the possible entries in that column. If someone's made a spelling mistake, it'll stand out quite well there. That's a simple use of a pivot table just to summarise one column. The more typical use is when we want to start counting things. I'm going to put the name column into the sigma values bottom right. Now, you can tick boxes here. I prefer to drag them as I get them into the right place that I want. If you tick and untick, they may go into one of the other areas, so I prefer to drag them in. But here, we're summarising all of that data by colour. So to go back to the original data, it's counted down, all the way down that colour column. It's found how many purples, how many blues, how many reds, and so on. So it's counted down that column, and here's the results. So for this example, I've still got the colour column listed and I've put name into the sigma values. Any field that is just text will mean we get a count of, And so this is counting up how many times in that column it's found blue, how many times it's found cyan, and so on. There are 83 items of data in that column, and those are the totals for each colour. So this is where pivot tables start to be really useful to summarise data into something like this straight away. Now if I wanted to change colour into something else, to get rid of it from the box here, you can just drag it and drop it on the main canvas. If I put department in there instead, I've got the whole of the data summarised by which department is listed in the department column. Now there are lots of ways to expand the data, to use more fields. If I put colour into the columns box, I'm going to get a two-way table. So I've got my department listed down the left, I've got my colours listed across the top, and for each intersection, how many times, for instance, people in the finance department selected cyan. You've got totals on each side and below, and this gives you a summary going both ways. Now that's one view of it. To try the same data but in a different view, I can drag colour into the rows box. So I've got two items in the rows box, department and colour, and you can see I've got my departments listed, and then within each department I've got a breakdown. Now you can swap things over. If I drag the colour selection up above department, my main listing is colours, and then my sub-listing for each area is department. This is the same data as the cross tab we saw earlier, but a slightly different arrangement. I think a lot of people prefer this one. You can open and close different sections to get more of a summary. Now I'm going to go back to a simple setup here. I'm going to get rid of department and just stick with colours. I'm actually going to get rid of the name field, because the alternative to having a text field in this bottom right hand box is to put something that's got numbers in it. If I put the bonus field, which has got figures into that box, instead of count of, we're getting a sum of. Excel has spotted their numbers and is adding them all up. So of all the people who selected blue, their total bonuses were 6,006. So another example of using a pivot table might seem a bit strange at first. If I put the bonus column in twice into the Sigma box, I've got the same data twice here. If I right click one of those columns, I can choose show values and have, for instance, a percentage of the grand total. So as well as the actual figure here, I've now got a percentage. Same data presented slightly differently in there. If I put the bonus column in again, I can also, instead of having it summarise the amount, I could find the average, or I could count how many times blue was selected, but I'm going to go for average. So the average bonus for the blue team was 500, the sum is 6,006, and that's 13.3% of the total bonus pool. So you can get a lot of information out from a simple set of data, all based on the original table that the data was in. Pivot tables are live, but they don't update automatically. So if, for instance, I was refreshing my data up here in the original and suddenly Abigail at the top here had a £2,000 bonus, if I go back to my pivot table that I'm working on, nothing will have changed here. To get that to refresh, you're going to need to use the Pivot Table Analyze menu at the top of the screen here, and that's got refresh on it. There's refresh, which will refresh the basic data. Refresh all will load any new headings, so it's the safer option, but in this case refresh will work as well. And it's quite subtle to spot, but Alice is in the purple team, and so their total and their average has gone up, and that's affected other figures too. So while we've got the Pivot Table Analyze menu up, let's have a look at a few things we can do. One of the most useful are slicers and timelines. Let me call up a slicer. If I call up a slicer by department, again, these are the list of the same column headings that you've got in your original data. If I put a department slicer on, I can select just the finance department, and the figures on the left here just apply to the people who are in the finance department. So this is a totally different set of figures just based on finance now. If I turn on multi-select, I can select multiple departments. If I click on the red cross, I can clear that, and we're seeing the whole set of data as original. Similarly, if I click back in my pivot table data there and go on the Analyze menu, I can put a timeline in. There's only one date field in my set of data, so Excel's only offering us one choice there. But if I put my date set on here, I could change the control to years and say I only want to see 2024 data. And again, each one of these is limiting the display of data. In this case, only data within the 2024 year. If I say only finance, then this is 2024 finance department by colour, and you can see the figures attached to them. So these slicers are very useful for a nice quick way and a very visual representation of seeing what the data is there. The filters tab can be used for a very similar thing, but I would recommend slicers as being a lot more obvious and easier for everybody to use if they're using pivot tables as reports. It's worth just resetting those back to the full data set because they will affect any future displays we see. Other things in the Analyze menu, there are lots of things up there. The main one I want to look at now is pivot charts. So if I call up a pivot chart, I can pick the type of chart I want. I'm just going to go for a column chart here and say OK. So pivot charts will display the data that is held within the main pivot table. So if, for instance, I didn't want my pivot chart to be showing the percentage bonus field, I'm going to need to get rid of that off the main pivot table. So if I drag that out and drop it on there, and I drag out my averages and drop them on there, I'm back to a very simple pivot table, but also the pivot chart I want. And again, these are all affected by these slicers. If I change things in the slicer, all of the figures in the table and the pivot chart are going to be affected by that. Because you might want lots of different views onto your data, I would tend to recommend creating different pivot tables for each report you want to run so that you're not having to change all of the settings every time you want to change it, particularly if other people are using the pivot charts. So here I could duplicate the tab. So if I go move or copy, make sure I select copy and then say OK to that. It's created pivot ideas 2, and maybe this one I want to have set to be by department rather than by colour. And again, I need to make sure I've watch out for these slicers. And so there is my pivot by department, there is my pivot by colour. And again, you can set up as many reports as you want, all looking back to the original data. Having a quick look in the pivot table design menu, the main thing here, you can change the colour scheme, but you can also do things like turn on and off totals for either rows or columns, depending on what you've set up on your main pivot table. So we're back to a nice simple pivot table here. List of colours, sum of the bonus for each colour. You can group things. We've seen groups if you put another thing in the rows column, such as grouping by department, but you can be more arbitrary than that if you want to. If I wanted to group together blue, cyan and green groups, I can highlight those, right click and use the group function. I can also then, if I wanted to group the other ones together, I can group those. So I've got 2 groups now, and then I can change the name of those if I want to and make them useful for me to analyse my data by arbitrary groups. And just undoing that and going back to a nice straightforward list. The other thing you might want to do is to sort the data. If I right click on my sums over here, I can sort largest to smallest. So I've got those in a particular order that I want to see them in down here. If we set up another example here, we're going to have department and colour, then name in the Sigma box. This is just counting how many people work for each department. If you want to go back to the original data, who is in the finance department who chose cyan? The number 6, I know how many of them there were. If I double click on that number 6, an additional tab will be created that will show me a copy of the original data. So this is copied out of the original table. It's not linked to anything. You can just delete this once you've got this information. It won't affect anything in the future, but it's a copy taken from the original. There's the original data there, and this copy is just a subset of that, but it does give you everyone who works for finance who chose cyan listed there for you. There's a lot more to pivot tables than that, but I hope that gives you an idea of some of the useful summarising that you can do with them. Well worth exploring. Just always try and keep them simple. Have multiple pivot tables for different reports, and you hopefully won't go far wrong. If you need a reminder of any of those, our pivot table examples tab just works through the settings for a few common pivot tables. Let's have a look at graphs. The basic Excel graph is normally set up by having titles at the top, maybe titles and a figure. On the insert menu, you can either pick your own particular chart that you want, or if you go on recommended charts, Excel will look at your data and recommend what it thinks is a good idea. So I'm going to accept the recommendation for a column chart here. That will pop up a chart. And the two main things to get your charts sorted out the way you want them. First thing is the chart design menu that pops up, add chart elements. So if you're missing something, say for instance you want data labels, and you decide you want them on each bar, at the top of each bar, you can turn those on there. That's going to set up data labels on your graph. Anything that's missing, that's the place to look for it. If you want to change something about your chart, the best thing is to fly out the formatting controls. If you right click on something on your chart, so I'm right clicking on the data bar here, if I go Format Data Series at the bottom of that right click menu, that will fly out the formatting controls here. It will vary depending on what you've right clicked on, but you typically get some settings. So here the gap width, I can change to manipulate my chart that way. You'll always get a colour palette. So in this case, the fill colour for those bars, I can change to be green instead of blue. If you want to swap to seeing something else, you can use the little menu here to select a different thing, such as say chart area, where the colour is the background to the whole chart. Text options, if it's relevant. And if you're not quite clear on what the right thing to select there is, you can right click on there directly on your chart, and the bottom item in this format menu will take you to the right place. So if I wanted my title to be on a box and then the text within it to be a different colour, I can go ahead and do that. Now a lot of things will also be doable by either hovering over them or right clicking them. Excel will put up little context menus, things like fonts here and that kind of thing. Nothing wrong with using those at all either, but the definitive set of controls is always in this format box on the right hand side. Let's look at another example. Moving on to sheet G here. Here's a more complicated set of data. Again, if you've got your data arranged nice and neatly like this, you can go on a recommended chart. Excel will offer you something. I'll just take the first one it's offering me. Let's have a look at a few things on the menus at the top here. You've got chart styles, so you can pick up an automated style from the top here. You can go on layout, and that'll give you kind of automated layouts, different ways of looking at your data. Generally shuffling things about like the legends and the titles where they appear. If you need to change the whole chart type, you can go back to the chart type box and change it into something totally different. Going to undo that. And then there's a useful button here, switch row and column. So for this one, I've got years along the bottom here, and then I've got data for each of the fruit. If I switch the row and column, I end up with fruit along the bottom, and then data for each year. So that's a useful button in a lot of situations where you've got more complex two-dimensional data like this. And if you need to change your data selection, you can call up the Select Data tab. Your next steps in Excel may well be to take up MOS. Now MOS is Microsoft Office Specialist Training. You can do exams in Word, PowerPoint and Excel. They take a certain level of self-revision, and then you can come onto the York campus and take a test with us. If you pass, you will get an internationally recognised certification to add to your CV, as well as gaining lots of knowledge on aspects of Excel, Word and PowerPoint. More help is available from Digital Training. Send us an email, book a tutorial session, or see the help pages on our website.